I filmed and scripted this several months ago, so number of seasons and some of the dates about the show are not correct. Okay, enjoy the video.
One of my favorite books is Anne with an E. I first read the book almost a decade ago, and every time I've read it, I fall in love all over again with Green Gables and Shirley and my first literary character crush, Gilbert Blythe. A few years ago, Netflix announced to produce an adaptation of my beloved childhood classic, and it just had its final season this year. When I first heard of this, I had so many thoughts, like, no! And why? And did anyone on the production team read the book before working on it? And admittedly, I was a little bit excited. I wanted to see how they portrayed the magic of Green Gables. So, let's look at the first season of Anne with an E.
Episode 1 starts with a man racing on a horse to catch a train. As it comes or leaves, we don't know yet, but we'll find out. I have a couple of issues with how this episode starts, but we'll get into that later in the review. For right now, let's just summarize the rest of the episodes. Matthew meets Anne and realizes there had been a mistake over the type of orphan they requested. Not knowing what to say, Matthew takes her back home and develops a fondness for her when Anne spends the entire ride back talking. Meanwhile, Marilla tells her friend Mrs. Rachel Lynde that they're adopting a boy, and Rachel disapproves. Anne renames everything to be more imaginative. Anne remembers Mr. Hammond died of a heart attack mid-beating, which didn't happen in the book, but let's not focus on that. Anne arrives, and Marilla and Matthew rather callously discuss the mistake, and Anne becomes emotionally distraught. Marilla takes Anne to Miss Spencer, the lady in charge of bringing her to the island. And then a dog jumps out and scares a horse, causing Anne to fall off and faceplant. She shoos the dog and calms the horse, and Marilla starts to gain admiration for her level-headedness. What? She faceplanted! Be more concerned! Marilla finds the idea that handing Anne over to another brutal woman apprehensible, and tells Anne she's on a week-long trial basis, which I'm sure won't create any problems later on in this episode. Mrs. Lynde comes over to meet Anne and rudely insults her, and proceeds to go off on Mrs. Lynde and run away. Marilla tells Anne that she has to apologize, and when Anne refuses, sends her to her room until she does, and Matthew sneaks up and persuades her to do so. Anne is introduced to Diana Barry, the nearest neighbor's daughter of the same age. Anne gains approval to be friends with Diana from Mrs. Barry, and it's a fun time. Marilla, later on, discovers that a family heirloom brooch has disappeared, and she confronts Anne. Anne says she didn't take it. Marilla demands she confesses, or else Anne will get sent back to the orphanage. Anne lies and claims she did take it and lost it, and Marilla sends her back to the orphanage. After Anne is sent back, Marilla is putting away clothes and sees her brooch. Not lost. She runs out to Matthew and he races off to catch the train. Look familiar? But he's too late. Oh no! And that ends episode 1. Episode 2. Anne arrives at the asylum and we see a flashback that she was bullied there and chooses not to go back in. Matthew is making his way downtown, actually to the mainland, to retrieve Anne. Meanwhile, Marilla waits and feels guilty because neither have returned yet and it's been a day. Matthew pawns a watch to get Fair to fetch Anne and travel back to Green Gables, and gets hit by a carriage, but manages to get to the orphanage in the middle of the night and sleeps outside. I'm sure he's not concussed. He finds out the next morning that Anne never went into the house and heads off to find her. Anne is at the train station reciting poetry for money when Matthew shows up. They argue, and Matthew calls her his daughter, and that fixes everything. So they head home. Anne is back at Green Gables, but clearly traumatized after being sent back to an abusive orphanage. And Marilla does not apologize. The Cuthberts head to the picnic and the Barrys trash talk Anne and won't let Diana approach her, even though they were playing together in the previous scene. Other townspeople start talking trash about her, loudly, within her ear range, and then two young children start circling her and singing about how she's a garbage person. Lovely town. This scene is rich straight from the nightmares of middle schoolers moving to a new area because it'll be good for the family. Anne runs away and Marilla goes and finally apologizes for returning her to sender. Yeah, it takes this woman over a day to apologize. They have a touching moment, and the episode ends with an admittedly touching moment of Anne being asked to sign her name in the Cuthbert family Bible, making her an official member of the family. Episode 3. Anne goes to school. Diana can't walk with Anne because she's an orphan, even though her parents already approved of the friendship, but I guess continuity isn't a thing yet. and almost immediately is being judged by her female classmates and low-key being bullied. Also, Anne gets bullied by the boys, even though she doesn't talk to them, and they bark at her constantly. It's so clever. Why is this happening? Cut away to the mothers asking Marilla to join their sewing club, an organization dedicated to discussing their girls' education, how they should receive the same as a man's. You go, girls. Cut back to Diana explaining the social structure of the school, and the boys non-stop barking at Anne. Good God. Anne and Diana see Percy Andrews and Mr. Phillips are having Star Wars sex, aka touching hands, and gets excited and talks about how she witnessed marital rape and was abused at the time, not realizing how messed up her upbringing was. Relatable things. The girls are immediately scandalized and ditch Anne. Marilla and the sewing circle discuss feminism and education. Anne leaves the school having made no friends and socially outcast herself. Well done. That's a record. Cut to Mrs. Lynde complaining Marilla about progressiveness and feminism. Anne comes home and works on division. The next morning, Billy, the boy who will not stop barking, tries to beat up Anne because she told everyone his sister is busting down in the supply room. Also, he calls her a dog so much it's looking less like a bullying tactic and getting more into a specific fetish territory. But then she's rescued by Gilbert, who is barely being introduced at this moment. Gilbert and Anne arrive at school, and the girls immediately introduce Anne into the rules of dibs. Ruby is crying because she likes Gilbert, and he dared to be another girl. Don't you know that you're her property, Gilbert? Cut to Marilla talking to one of the moms and being socially outcasted and told to homeschool her child. Sounds like a regular PTA. Anne reads aloud and with actual emotion, and everyone except Gilbert hates it. To be honest, I wished for classmates like this. Does anyone else remember how annoying popcorn reading was when everyone did monotone voice? The cat in the hat sat on the mat. Never change, Anne. Never change. Gilbert tries to talk to Anne, tries to give her an apple from his orchard. Anne has the self-control to turn down that scrumptious apple. Look at that thing. The Cuthberts find out, and Marilla is offended and talked about until Matthew points out that an 11-year-old was exposed to marital rape. Apparently, Marilla is not the sharpest tool in the shed. Marilla goes to apologize, and Mrs. Andrew calls the 11-year-old a trollop, which means sexually promiscuous. You are calling an 11-year-old a whore, woman. And Marilla roasts her Christian style. Gilbert tries to get her attention by throwing papers? I think those are papers across the room. Anne refuses to acknowledge his existence, and Gilbert, not giving up, attempts to give her the apple a second time. Anne refuses to acknowledge again, and so he yanks her braid and she slaps him across the face with a slate. Gilbert is somehow oriented enough to make a quippy remark instead of collapsing from the concussion he inevitably has. The teacher makes Anne stand in front of the class under the sentence, Anne surely has a very bad temper. Gilbert tries to take the blame. Anne gets upset, and then she just runs out and goes crying to Marilla, saying she'll never go back to school. Episode 4. Rachel recommends to wait till Anne asks to go to school again. Anne burns the pie because she's imagining, so Marilla tries to force her to go back. Anne has an emotional breakdown at the idea of going back to school where no one likes her, starts hallucinating about her imaginary friend Kitty Maurice in the mirror, though because they didn't really bother to explain who she is, it looks like Anne's having a mental breakdown. Anne decides to pretend to go to school, but ditches. Diana and Ruby Gillis come and reveal she hasn't come back at all because they have her books. So Marilla calls in the pastor. He tells her not to bother with education and to prepare to be a wife. Anne imagines what she could do for a living that doesn't involve going to school. The Gillis house is on fire, the entire town works together to put the fire out, and Anne and Diana hug during a fire. Anne runs into the house to close every door and stuff the cracks and close the windows in hopes of slowing down the fires. Anne nearly collapses from smoke inhalation, but doesn't. Anne's actions do slow down the fire, and Ruby has to stay in her house till the repairs are made, and she has the audacity to be ungrateful. Anne proves to be a better person by not telling Ruby to shut up while Ruby cries loudly in the bed next to her, and instead entertaining her with stories. They deliver cookies and get bullied. I would forgive every change if Anne just says fuck it and starts giving Billy Andrews the beatdown he deserves. Unfortunately, it does not come to happen. Billy tells them to go home and bake cookies, and Gilbert tells them they already did. Ruby befriends Anne, and they start a story club with Diana. Anne decides to return home and not be a housewife. Yay, feminism! Episode 5. It starts off with Mr. Phillips using a spelling bee to hit on Prissy Andrews because she won't talk to him. Then he insults her. Then he apologizes. And Gilbert makes moon eyes at Anne during the spelling bee, and then Phyllis proposes via spelling bee. Ladies, who said romance is dead? Anne starts her period. Gilbert has a sick, dying dad, and clearly takes on a caregiver role. Anne learns how periods are dark secrets and rides the hormonal roller coaster. Marilla allows her to have Diana over for tea, and Anne complains about not having puffed sleeves. Matthew goes to get a dress from the dress shop, but he's incredibly shy around women, so it takes him a couple attempts to buy one. Anne and Diana get drunk by accident when Anne mistakenly grabs the wrong bottle. We meet Jeannie, Matthew's former romantic love interest, who owns the dress shop. Matthew used to have a crush, apparently. Mrs. Barry comes over and discovers the girls got lit on currant wine. Dan is forbidden from seeing her again, or sitting together at school, or even talking. Matthew asks Marilla if she thinks about Michael, their dead older brother, who I don't know who he is. He never existed in the books. I guess we'll find out. Diana and Anne have a tragic and dramatic goodbye befitting 11-year-olds being forcibly separated. Anne is forced to bring books to Gilbert Blythe because he's missing school, and that doesn't make sense because they're not friends. Literally any male student who didn't have a history of attacking him would have made sense. Anne meets Gilbert's dad, who is actively dying. Matthew gives Anne the puff sleeve dress. Episode 6. Episode starts with Diana running over to say her sister is horribly ill. Anne realizes it's croup, and her Aunt Josephine doesn't know what to do. Aunt Josephine is just in the way. Doctor confirms that Anne saved Minnie May's life. Diana and Anne are allowed to become friends again. Gilbert's dad probably just died. Anne sees Gilbert every day, apparently, and realizes when he comes back he's going to be an orphan, and how can she hate an orphan? Then a funeral! Huzzah! And Gilbert and Anne are orphan buddies. Then it's revealed that Marilla used to court Gilbert's father. Anne tries to talk orphan to orphan, but gets rejected because he has it better off than him, and Gilbert doesn't take too kindly to hearing that his struggles are not valid. Josephine Barry talks with Anne about how she can be her own woman, girl power. They make shepherd's pie, and it's awkward because Anne has an emotional revelation and cries on potatoes. They talk about marriage and love. Gilbert is trying to decide if he's going to sell the family farm or even wants to farm. Then Matthew finds out about the ship holding his crops has sunk and there's no insurance. The boys at school have a sexist conversation with Gilbert about he needs to come back because Anne is being smart, and Gilbert throws hands at Billy. Marilla and Gilbert talk at his grave and talk about how John, his father, was a traveler. Marilla reveals she didn't travel with John because of family obligations and regretted it, and works on an apology letter to Gilbert. Josephine tells her not to give up on romance, and what's important is not living a life of regrets. Cut to Matthew at a bank. Cut to Anne running to talk to Gilbert to apologize, maybe. Cut to, oh no, he's gone. She's too late. Episode 7. Gossipy nag. Josie Pye is telling everyone the Cuthberts are poor. Does this bank have no confidentiality? Anne finds out, and Josie asks if Anne knows if they're going to keep her. Anne runs home where Marilla and Matthew are arguing because he took a loan on the farm to buy crops to make up for their losses, and then he has a heart attack. Oh my god, they killed him. No, wait! The doctor pronounces him lucky to be alive. He's not dead yet. Marilla verifies they're still keeping her, which is good because it's kind of been on thin ice this season. Marilla and Anne go to ask for an extension. The bank calls their loan back, so they have till the end of the month to pay it back because banks are bastards. Marilla refuses to take charity, even if it would help them from being homeless. Anne and Jerry to go upon their stuff, sell the horses because Marilla can't leave Matthew alone, so she pulls a Dumbledore and leaves it to the children. Anne is a brat about needing Jerry's help. Anne tries to make her property worth more by lying about its origins. Jerry gets mugged by 2 adult men because why not at this point? Anne meets Gilbert. They have dinner together, and the muggers walk in because, I mean, again, why not? I don't know what's happening anymore. Anne and Gilbert apologize for their actions and make amends. Gilbert's working on his docks and is going to travel before he decides if he wants to come back as a farmer, even though in the book he wanted to. Okay, just save it till the end. Save it till the end. Anyways, the 4 alone eventual lovers part with obvious regret and longing as Gil goes to work on a ship. Then Jerry shows up and says he was robbed in front of the window where the robbers are. Just turn around, Jerry, please. They go to Miss Barry's and she tries to give him money, but the age-old "we don't accept charity" to further a plotline is in action. Back at Green Gables, Matthew is wishing to die so they can get life insurance. Lighthearted series. Miss Barry pays for Jerry to stay on at Green Gables. Back at Green Gables, Matthew walks around, even though the doctor said he's not supposed to. There's dramatic music playing, and he draws a gun. Oh, no. And then his attempted event is interrupted by his childhood crush walking in while he spills bullets. Anne realizes she can earn more money by putting her years of forced child labor to use and cleaning houses. Christmas time, and Marilla announces that she put an advertisement for boarders at Green Gables. With that steady income and the portion of money they've managed to raise to buy back part of the loan, they're going to talk new terms with the bank after the holidays. The boarders end up being people who mugged Jerry. Dun dun dun! The series ends with Anne making a face while she feels an emotion that's hopefully not attractiveness to that clearly adult man. Roll credits, and that was the end of season 1 of Anne of Green Gables.
Anne's childhood is discussed mainly as a short chapter in the book. Anne also had imaginary best friends because she didn't have time to socialize with kids her age. In lieu of actual playmates, she formed deep emotional attachments in her imagination in order to gain companionship. In the book, Anne is the only source of backstory, and she chooses to not delve into her former abuse and neglect. And although Marilla can easily discern that abuse and neglect happened, she doesn't know all the details. The adaptation instead uses flashbacks and doesn't leave Anne's upbringing with any ambiguity. We see that she's physically abused and treated like a servant. They go so as far to include bullying at the asylum, which was never mentioned in the novel. Anne also, in an effort to gain social favor, accidentally discusses marital rape she witnessed without knowing what was happening. This also never happened in the book. As a childhood abuse survivor, I don't have a problem with the show using flashbacks to tell the audience how awful it was. I do have a problem with the show wanting to go in and highlight how awful it was and even add extra details without being willing or realizing how this is going to change how Anne behaves. Let's examine the first use of the flashback, the train scene. Anne is distracted watching the countryside, feeling a mixture of uneasiness and hope, and then her attention's pulled by the sound of a crying baby. She starts to look more worried. The camera cuts to the crying baby to show the audience it's just an upset baby, and then we cut back to Anne, who is terrified. The music starts to become more chaotic and unharmonious. The camera zooms in on her face as Anne starts to breathe harder. The baby is crying, becomes muffled to Anne's ears, and we see a flashback of abuse. Anne is having a panic attack or possibly being triggered at the same time. After she's all right, she says, "I like imagining more than remembering." The flashbacks aren't just for the audience, they're being experienced by Anne in real time with the show. The show sets up a child with potential PTSD or trauma after showing her being triggered into a flashback or panic attack by just the sound of a crying child. If you want to set that up, it'll change how Anne interacts with the world depending on how severe it is and how well it's managed. And you have to take that into account. The effects of trauma are more than just convenient flashbacks to show the audience as a character's backstory. Constantly reliving traumatic events is going to have a bigger impact than dropping a spoon or zoning out for a second. But then it gets dropped after a couple episodes, once the audience has been filled in on her backstory enough. So the show goes in hard on how much trauma and abuse she's experienced, and then chooses to not address how being triggered by crying children or just looking at a teacup would regularly affect Anne's life and ability to function. Anne's coping mechanism is her wild imagination. It provides a sense of escapism from a harsh reality. But then she gets adopted and moves into Green Gables, and she establishes friendship, flourishes socially, does well academically, gets exercise, is well nourished, and starts to thrive. And then her challenge becomes learning how to fit her imagination not as a need in order to cope with her existence, but rather having it used for pleasure and learning to focus on reality even when it's not. The whole second episode. Oh, that was painful to watch. The second episode is about 44 minutes long, and in it there are 33 minutes of inaccuracies until we get to one scene that was actually in the book, the picnic. And they messed that up too, which means there are 44 minutes of inaccuracies. An entire episode from a series that's adapted off of a book, and it only has, if I'm being generous, 2 scenes from the book, and they still don't get it to be accurate. This first season is only 7 episodes long, and for the second episode, or any episodes for the matter, to have nothing from the book it's claiming to adapt is a waste of runtime and also a failure on the adaptation process. Sometimes adaptations will have scenes that aren't described or mention the source material to show what's going on with the character that otherwise be off screen or give the audience a better understanding of situations. Or they'll have scenes that didn't happen in the source material but are still in the same thread and tone of what happened in the source material, and that's either to cut down on time or change things slightly, but the overall idea is still there. Like adding her name to the family Bible. That was a really cute and sweet scene, and it was so validating to Anne and her desire to have a family. But unlike the rest of the episode, the tone does not match the typical tone of the book. The plot of episode 2 is cruel and traumatizing to Anne, and it assassinates Marilla's character. The end of the season completely diverts from the book as well, and there's a really big problem with the plot they divert to, how they do it, and the tone they choose over the book. But that's a rant I will segue into later. Right now, I want to segue into how the second episode destroys Marilla and Anne's relationship. Marilla and Anne's relationship. Marilla does temporarily lose her brooch in both the book and TV show, but what follows after the book is strikingly different than the show. In the book, Marilla finds out that her brooch is missing and confronts Anne. Anne admits to touching the brooch, but not that she took it. Marilla, upset with Anne for not listening, sends her to her room and grounds her from a picnic that Anne was really looking forward to attending. Matthew believes that Anne is innocent even though the evidence isn't in her favor. Marilla tells Anne that she can't leave her room until she confesses, meaning Anne will miss the church picnic she's been looking forward to. Anne confesses the next day to taking the brooch and losing in the Lake of Shining Waters. Marilla, enraged over her family heirloom being lost, tells her she's allowed to go to the picnic and sends her back to her room. Later, Marilla discovers her brooch got snagged on her shawl and Anne had lied about losing her brooch. She immediately goes to Anne, and this is what happened.
Anne Shirley, said Marilla solemnly, I've just found my brooch hanging to my black lace shawl. Now I want to know what rigmarole you told me this morning meant. Why, you said you'd keep me here until I confessed, returned Anne wearily. And so I decided to confess because I was bound to get to the picnic. I thought out a confession last night after I went to bed and made it as interesting as I could, and I said it over and over so I wouldn't forget it. But you wouldn't let me go to the picnic after all, so all my trouble was wasted. Marilla had to laugh in spite of herself, but her conscience pricked her. Anne, you do beat all, but I was wrong. I see that now. I shouldn't have doubted your word when I've never known you to tell a story. Of course, it wasn't right for you to confess to a thing you hadn't done. It was very wrong to do so. But I drove you to it. So if you forgive me, Anne, I'll forgive you and we'll start swearing again. And now go get yourself ready for the picnic. Anne flew up like a rocket. Oh, Marilla, isn't it too late? No, it's only 2 o'clock. They won't be more than well gathered yet, and it'll be an hour before they have tea. Wash your face and comb your hair and put on your knit gingham. I'll fill a basket for you. There's plenty of stuff baked in the house, and I'll get Jerry to hitch up the sorrel and drive you down to the picnic ground. Oh, Marilla, exclaimed Anne, flying to the washstand. 5 minutes ago I was so miserable I was wishing I'd never been born, and now I want to change places with an angel.
And then Anne goes to the picnic. This scene serves as a learning moment for Marilla, because she didn't believe Anne when she would have told the truth. She pushed Anne into a false confession and unjustly punished her. When she finds the brooch, she immediately goes to Anne and finds out the truth and apologizes. Not only does she apologize, but she takes responsibility for forcing Anne into the position where she had to lie to be believed, and then drives her to the picnic so Anne can get there quicker. This lesson isn't for Anne about telling falsehoods. It's for Marilla to realize she needed to have more faith in Anne's character instead of reacting on her anger. We see Anne's guardian, an adult, make a mistake and own up to it. Anne is actually more mature in the situation, and when Marilla refuses to go to the picnic after her confession, she says,
My heart is broken. You'll feel remorse of conscience someday, I expect, for breaking it, Marilla, but I forgive you. Remember when the time comes that I forgave you.
She's only 11, she's been abused her whole life, and she still forgives Marilla before she's even apologized or realized she's done something wrong. It shows incredible character maturity on Anne's part. This scene serves to grow Marilla's character, and the way the show chose to do it is unacceptable. Instead of, you're grounded, you can't go to the picnic, it's you're grounded and are going to be sent back to a life of servitude. Sure, Marilla says asylum, but she's very aware that Anne has been used as a serving girl her whole life, and that is the fate she will most likely get. Not only that, it implies that Matthew has no backbone whatsoever when it comes to Anne. Yes, in the book, Marilla tells Matthew that she'll be the one bringing up Anne, and Matthew is not the disciplinarian, but he does challenge Marilla or use indirect influence when he feels like she's doing the wrong thing. He wants to keep Anne and brings it up to Marilla, saying they could be good for her. He could hire a farmhand, and she might like the company. And when Marilla rebukes him, he goes to bed. But the next day, he tells Marilla he's hired the farmhand anyway. He puts the seed in Marilla to keep Anne and think about how they could help her by keeping her on. When Anne will apologize to Mrs. Lynde, Matthew secretly convinces her to do so. Marilla's brooch is lost. Matthew advocates for Anne, even in the face of the evidence, knowing her character. Matthew is shy and laid back, but he is not a pushover. Yet, in the show, you're supposed to believe that this man who loves this child so much would just let her get sent back to an orphanage over a brooch and dropped in the water by accident. That's not in line with his character, or really any character you'd want in a decent human being. The first time Anne was grounded, Matthew was worried and immediately made sure Marilla would still feed Anne when she was confined to her room. And I'm just supposed to believe he let her get sent away to a life of torment. Yeah, right. But that's nothing compared to how this changes Marilla. Sending her back to the asylum over a lost brooch isn't someone overreacting in the heat of the moment. It's cruel. Full stop. Yes, it's her family heirloom, and her only jewelry, and her most prized possession. But that is no excuse to send a child to an asylum, and no normal person would do that. Anne claims to have lost it while playing with it, and Marilla has a right to ground her, and she has a right to be angry that Anne didn't listen. But to throw Anne out of a family for an accident is monstrous. And then the show has the audacity to show Marilla crying and feeling remorseful because of this mistake, and I'm supposed to sympathize or feel that she has realized the misdeed or action, but this woman is in her 50s. She's the one who caused this pain. No mature adult should be throwing out a child for an accident. When Anne finally returns, Marilla doesn't apologize. She waits at least a day, and she only apologizes after Anne is viciously bullied and is sobbing in the woods, which implies that Marilla never intended to apologize, and it took this poor child crying for her to realize, maybe I need to ask forgiveness for sending this abused orphan back to a place of torment. Throughout this episode, they tried to weave in the characters' personalities and behaviors with this massive change, and it doesn't work. Like when Anne returns, Marilla's happy, but she can't bring herself to tell Anne because she's never been one to openly express her emotions. It just doesn't work. I know I'm supposed to think, oh, look, she's really happy, she's back, look, she's patting the dress and just admiring it because Anne's back and she misses her, and she just doesn't know how to express it. It isn't used to being a parental figure. But you can't elicit that reaction from me when Marilla just traumatized the main character by throwing her out like garbage. This adaptation clearly wants to highlight Anne's abusive upbringing and how it affects her and stunts her socially, and make it about how she perseveres and she wins over people and finds her place and has a found family. Yet they have her adoptive parent behave like an abuser during our first week of living with them. I'm not even kidding. The scene where she sends her away plays out like an abusive parent interacting with their victim. You have the child breaking a small trivial rule, and then the abuser doesn't believe them when they tell the truth. They call him a liar. They give him an ultimatum that's going to result in a punishment. And then when the child confesses, they still get punished anyways. And when or if the abuser is finally forced to apologize, they make it emotional and get the child to forgive them, even if they're necessarily not supposed to be. And then, of course, act like everything's okay, even if they screwed up big time. I want to clarify, Marilla, aside from the scene and potentially one other, is not abusive, and this behavior does not fall in line with how she proceeds in the book or how she behaves in the rest of the show, which makes the deviation really frustrating and confusion. The thing that angers me the most is the way the characters react and how they portray the scene perfectly. Watching Anne's face as she's trying to figure out how to behave in front of Marilla so she'll be allowed to stay, the fear in her voice as she puts together the lie, and then begging, is so realistic and great. I believe that this is a desperate 11-year-old trying to prove her innocence and stay in her new home, and then having her heart broken when it doesn't work out. Her awkwardness and formal obedience towards Marilla, she's clearly trying not to set her off so she won't be set away again. How the actress delivers her line when she warns Jerry he could be accused of stealing, it's perfect. This is a girl who's been traumatized, who had her home and security taken away, and there was nothing she could have done to prevent it. She's an abuse survivor who's in an abusive situation again and doesn't know behaviors will keep her safe. The writers and directors and actors clearly understood how this punishment would affect Anne and hurt her, and how she wouldn't adjust to coming back home easily. But then Marilla apologizes and it's all good. No other further consequences. Matthew calls her his daughter at a train station. Everything's fine. No trauma-reinforcing behavior here, folks. They used part of the original dialogue from the book during Marilla's apology. I'm sorry I didn't believe you, and what's worse, I pushed you to lie. Can you forgive me? You threw her out of the house. How are you managing to still make this about her lying? That is not the worst thing that's come from your accusations. Whoever wrote this doesn't seem to understand that being thrown out of her new family would have a lasting impact, and they expect the audience to accept that. Whoever wrote this scene doesn't seem to understand that being thrown out of her new home would have a lasting impact, and they expect the audience to just accept that their relationship is repaired. For the record, it's plausible that Anne would forgive Marilla and have a bonding moment, but that doesn't make this a good relationship. It is fundamental to a child's development to have love and stability and be cared for. Anne wants to be accepted, she wants to belong, and she wants stability, and accepting Marilla's apology and pushing aside the fear and pain would be your most obvious way to get it. But instead of having a parental-child relationship based on, you took me in because you didn't feel it was right for me to be treated like a servant, instead of having a childhood and wanting to end the abuse, so you stepped up to be a parent even though you didn't feel suited for the role. And sure, you made mistakes, and there were some times when you were stricter than necessary, but at the end of the day, you loved me and encouraged me and supported my education, especially when societal expectations didn't. We have a mutually respectful and loving relationship because you taught me how to own up to my mistakes and face reality, even when it's unromantic, and your stability and respect helped me heal from my abusive families and like myself. Out of that relationship, the bond we have is you threw me out of the house over a family heirloom I told you I did not take, and you wouldn't even apologize or say you missed me until I was crying in the woods. But you never hit me, and objectively speaking, you're better than the Hammonds or the girls at the asylum, so I'll make peace with this because this is as good as I am going to get. There's no good reason for this change, and what's worse is they don't even let it affect Anne in a long-term sense. She forgives Marilla, and it's played like, ooh, she apologized and signed her name in the Bible, she's a Cuthbert now, Marilla owned up to her mistake, everything's fine. But it's not. Sending a child away over jewelry is cruelty, and the fact that it's played as a tragic mistake that makes Marilla realize how much she cares about Anne is BS. She loves Anne and is happy she kept her, and she may not express it as well as Matthew does, but that's her character flaw. Clearly, the writers wanted drama and a cliffhanger for the episode, and to have an emotional bonding scene to prove that they're bonded, but people can bond without going through traumatizing experiences. Having someone consistently be there for you is actually really nice and still totally believable. In conclusion, this change was unnecessary and damages the relationships Matt with Anne has with the Cuthberts. It's a waste of time, and the writers didn't follow through with it in the long term. The dynamic Anne has with her peers in the show is different. Diana is Anne's first friend, and Anne did need permission from Mrs. Barry before she could socialize with her. Then the picnic happens, and the Barrys suddenly won't let Diana go to her and are trash-talking her as if this is the first time they've met, but it's not, and they have been playing together in the previous scene after Anne returned, which means Diana and the Barrys would have known, and Diana would have had to have permission to go out and play, so why they're suddenly on the second time of seeing her not allowing Diana to go over just doesn't make sense, so I guess they could imply a social everyone can see them thing with that, but if they care so much about what everyone thinks, they wouldn't let Diana carry on in private with Anne. On top of that, the rest of her peers just relentlessly bully her or shun her in episode 3, but Anne in the book doesn't struggle to be socially accepted. She attends the church picnic by herself, while the actual event doesn't happen in the book, and does tell Marilla about it afterwards.
That night, a thoroughly happy, completely tired out Anne returned to Green Gables in a state of beautification impossible to describe. Oh, Marilla, I've had a perfectly scrumptious time. Scrumptious is a new word I learned today. I heard Mary Alice Bell use it. Isn't it very expressive? Everything was lovely. We had a splendid tea, and then Mr. Harmon Andrews took us all on a row And then Mr. Harmon Andrews took us all for a row on the Lake of Shining Waters, 6 of us at a time, and Jane Andrews nearly fell overboard. She was leaning out to pick water lilies, and if Mr. Andrews hadn't caught her by her sash just in the nick of time, she'd have fallen in and probably drowned. I wish it had been me. It would have been such a romantic experience to have nearly drowned. It would have been such a thrilling tale to tell. And we had the ice cream. Words fail to describe that ice cream, Rilla. I assure you it was sublime.
Anne was not bullied or openly gossiped about, and there's no mention of tiny children roasting her in song form. She has a good time and got along well with the other girls. Then there's how episode 3 covers it, and how Anne's classmates treat her, and well, here's how Anne's first day is in the book.
There are a lot of nice girls in school, and we had a scrumptious fun playing at dinner time. It's so nice to have a lot of little girls to play with. But of course, I like Diana best, and always will. I adore Diana. I'm dreadfully far behind the others. They're all in fifth grade, and I'm only in the fourth. I feel like it's kind of a disgrace. But there's not one of them that has such imagination as I have, and I soon found that out. We had reading and geography and Canadian history and dictation today. Mr. Phillips said my spelling was disgraceful, and he held up my slate so that everybody could see it marked all over. I felt so mortified, Marilla. He might have been politer to a stranger, I think. Ruby Gillis gave me an apple, and Sophia Sloane lent me a lovely pink card with "May I see you home" on it. I'm to give it back to her tomorrow. And Tilly Boulter let me wear her bead ring all the afternoon. Can I have some of those pearl beads off the old pincushion in the garnet to make myself a ring? And oh, Marilla, Jane Andrews told me that Minnie MacPherson told her that she heard Prissy Andrews tell Sarah Gillis that I had a very pretty nose, Marilla. That is the first compliment I've ever had in my life, and you can't imagine what a strange feeling it gave me.
In the book, Anne gets her first compliment, gets gifts, has no struggles with socializing, and in fact she enjoys having all the playmates and adjusts quite well to having children her own age. Everyone likes Anne, except maybe Josie Pye, but that is just how the Pies are. And in the show, everyone takes turns either making snide comments or being tactless about her being an orphan. I could believe that a new girl would have a hard time fitting into a small town when she's had a vastly different upbringing, but that's not how it happened in the source material. So why do they feel a need to center an entire episode about how she's bullied at school by nearly everyone and struggles to be accepted into a social group? And why are the boys constantly calling her a dog? She hardly ever talks to the boys in the course of the entire first book. In the show, Anne wants so badly to be accepted that she won't talk to Gilbert when the girls tell her to back off. It's not that her actions aren't understandable, but in the book, Anne had a sense of justice in spite of her upbringing. Sure, she wanted people's approval and affection, but she also knew people weren't supposed to be cruel to her, and that she deserved to be treated well. When Mrs. Lynde starts to insult her to her face, she fought back verbally. She knows an adult shouldn't be tearing her down, and she doesn't take it lying down either. They keep that scene in the series, but then have Anne bend over completely to earn inclusion amongst her peers. And yes, Anne hasn't had real friends before. She did create imaginary friends for both the Thomases and the Hammonds, Violetta and Katie Maurice, although Katie is only mentioned in the series and isn't really gone into detail about. Anne never had any real friends until Green Gables, so she created 2 different imaginary friends for each household location and imagined one of them in the creek at the home that she lived at, and Katie Maurice was her reflection in a china cabinet. She left her imaginary friend, she left him forever. They didn't fall in with, and she had really emotional goodbyes and still misses them at the beginning of the book. In the show, when she's talking to Katie, it comes off more that she's had a break from reality because you don't understand who Katie is, and it just seems like she's spiraling to such a point that she's having a episode of psychosis. They changed it so Anne, who didn't struggle to be socially accepted except for by the Pies, is now getting bullied by everyone, including the Pies, and her strong-willed nature suddenly takes a back seat, even though she always stood up for herself. It doesn't really make sense, and they don't give her a character arc of staying up for herself more. She just ends up being included because she plays along by the rules. Anne and Gilbert. Anne and Gilbert are iconic enemies to lovers, slow burn story arc, and the way it plays out in the show is like clicking on a completed slow burn fanfic and the word count is only 5,000. To understand differences between the show's take on Anne and Gilbert's relationship and how it happens in the book, it'd probably just be best to summarize what happens.
3 weeks after Anne starts school, Gilbert Blythe, the most eligible boy in the schoolroom, starts school. Gilbert is 14 and likes to pull pranks and tease the girls. Anne first sees him pinning Ruby Gillis's braid to her chair, so when she stands up, she shrieks, but Gilbert pulls the pin out and no one notices his prank. He winks at Anne, but she thinks it's weird for anyone to flirt with her. He tries to get her attention during school, but Anne is busy daydreaming, so he grabs her braid and calls her carrots. Anne screams at him and breaks her slate over his head, shattering it. Gilbert immediately takes blame for her outburst, but Anne is punished by staying under the sentence. Anne Shirley has a very bad temper, and Shirley must learn to control her temper. Gilbert immediately apologizes to Anne after school, but Anne has decided to go to her grave hating him. The next day, Anne is punished for being late coming back from lunch and forced to sit next to Gilbert Blythe. Gilbert gives her candy when no one's looking, and she immediately crushes it. Savage. And then quits school. When Anne finally returns to school, she decides to beat him academically and throws herself into her studies, but no matter how often she takes his rank, he's just happy for her. 2 years later, Anne nearly drowns in the lake when her raft sinks, and as she clings to a bridge post for dear life, Gilbert happens to be rowing by and save Anne. He apologizes again and asks to bury her the truce, but Anne doubles down on her grudge, and Gilbert ignores her from then on, turning her one-sided academic feud into a two-sided one when they both enroll in advanced classes to prep for college. Anne actually regrets spurning Gilbert, but is too proud to say anything, especially when Gilbert gives attention to every single girl but her. So Anne pretends like it doesn't bother her, when it does. And Gilbert pretends he doesn't like her anymore, but he does. And this goes on for a couple years. They take college entrance exams and tie in first place, and compete academically at school, though less aggressively. They both end up top students at Queen, and Anne wins a scholarship. Matthew suffers cardiac arrest after this, and Marilla is told she'll go blind if she continues to sew or read, and she decides she'll sell the farm because she'd be too depressed living alone, with Anne away working in town as a teacher. But Gilbert gives up his job at the local schoolhouse and tells the board to give it to Anne so they can afford to keep the family farm. Anne goes on and apologizes, their feud finally ends, and the book ends with them becoming friends. They will later fall in love and get married in the following sequel books.
Anne's biggest insecurity is her appearances, and she has a big temper and a tendency to lash out when she's made fun of. So when Gilbert calls her carrots, it hits her biggest insecurity, her red hair that her foster parents have repeatedly told her that made her ugly and wicked. Anne acts out and decides to never talk to him. Gilbert, for the rest of the book, whenever he's mentioned, is amicable to Anne and tries to make up for his misdeed, but Anne also rebukes him every single time. While deciding to hate someone forever over being called carrot seems trivial, it highlights on how insecure she is about her appearance. She also screams at Mrs. Lynde when she insults her and is fully ready to live in her bedroom rather than apologize, but Matthew convinces her otherwise. Unfortunately for Gilbert, Diana can't convince Anne to make amends. Anne even refuses to say his name for a couple of years. Whereas in the show, their first introduction is Gilbert rescuing her from a mugging, which she proceeds to ignore him for most of the walk. It's a known fact that at that age, all boys have cooties, but she's being ostracized by most of her peers. You'd think she'd at least thank Gilbert for saving her, considering he's one of the only people in Avonlea that's actually being nice to her and not wait until school to say anything. Then the girls have been bullying her, tell her to back off, and she starts nailing Gilbert in a desperate attempt to be reaccepted into the clique. It makes the whole motivation for the slate scene play out differently. Anne yells, "I'm not talking to you," as she slaps him across his face, which, ow, that would definitely hurt more than on the top of his head. Instead of, "You mean hateful boy, how dare you?" Instead of Anne lashing out because Gilbert managed to hit on Anne's biggest insecurity and igniting her temper, she's lashing out because she's trying to regain acceptance amongst her classmates who are already shunning her. Anne holds her grudge for 5 years, yet the shaky foundation the show gives it only really has it last in the show's universe for less than a year. Anne has many great qualities. She's kind and imaginative and smart and a good friend, but she has faults. She's insecure, she has a bad temper, she holds grudges, she tends to react emotionally and to an extreme. She can get wrapped up in her imagination and struggle to focus on a boring reality. And her grudge against Gilbert highlights that. Is it reasonable for her to hold a grudge for over 5 years over one insult when the person apologized repeatedly? No, but it's not supposed to be. This is one of her faults. She overreacted and digs her heels in. It really shows how sensitive she is about her hair. She tries to get back at Gilbert by being better than him academically, though that doesn't work for the first 2 years because he just congratulates her. When Gilbert apologizes again after saving her life, she considers burying the hatchet. She isn't really mad anymore until she remembers the pain she felt when he called her carrots and reacts to an emotional extreme and says, "I shall never be friends with you, Gilbert Blythe. I don't want to be." Yet, she then regrets her response and wants to cry, but she's too proud to own up to her mistake and that she's overreacted. The regret for about a few more years until she finally reconciles with him. The show keeps Gilbert the same, aside from his story arc. He's popular, smart, is immediately taken with Anne and likes everything about her, including her red hair and freckles. He's genuinely a good person. Even though Anne hardly speaks to him or is even civil with him, he gives up his job at the local school and another location at the end of the book so Anne and Marilla can afford to keep their family farm. Anne does befriend him at the end after this, but he didn't know what happened. He just cares about her and wanted to help her. Their relationship is supposed to be a slow burn. They don't become friends until the end of the first book because Anne has to work on her own faults and get over her insecurities about her body and learn not to overreact before she can forgive Gilbert. But the show speeds through that by having her be the one to bring his books and killing off his dad, so now they're similar. How can I hate someone who's an orphan? That's not rational. Neither is hating someone who apologized for insulting you. It's not a grudge that's rooted in rationality. It's rooted in her insecurity, and that's why it persists, though I guess the writers missed that detail. She gets forced to give Gilbert his school books, even though the boys and girls didn't really play together. Also, Anne broke a slate across his face, so I think the teacher would choose to send literally any student that doesn't have a history of violence against him. But no, she needs a reason to see Gilbert and realize how difficult his life is and get a misogynistic comment from the teacher about how Gilbert's his best student, even though Anne and Gilbert are shown to be pretty evenly matched. It doesn't even make sense when Anne claims Gilbert lives to torment her in the show because her first introduction is when he saves her from being mugged. Sure, he hits on her insecurities accidentally by calling her carrots, but Gilbert also talks to Anne multiple times and is overtly pleasant. Oh, he torments me! No, he doesn't. He had one bad interaction with you in between great ones. Whereas in the book, Anne's first impression of Gilbert is pulling an immature prank, and then he calls her carrots, and she refuses to talk to him. She doesn't say he's tormenting her, she just wants to beat him academically because he insulted her. She allows her first impression to maintain her prejudice of him for years and doesn't talk to him, so there's no way that it can get refuted, really. Show Anne is forced to confront that he's a good person and is facing the hardship of being an orphan like her, and it jumpstarts her getting over her grudge and being mature and apologizing 4 years too early. They draw Anne and Gilbert's feud a little bit longer by having Anne fail to console Gilbert at his father's funeral by making it all herself. And that is truly awful. It is like watching a train accident happen in slow motion. I didn't know my parents, but you did. I don't remember my parents, but you will. Kelly, you're lucky compared to me. But Anne realizes she's wrong and just misses her chance to apologize. But then she meets Gilbert in town when she's selling her stuff, and they apologize and bury the hatchet of a feud that only lasted less than a year before Gilbert ships off to the sea. Both of them clearly having feelings for each other, but not knowing how to express it. Having a prolonged childish grudge was the best thing arguably that happened to Anne aside from getting adopted. Gilbert is a few years older than Anne, but starts the school year in the same book. At that time period, children would go buy books for a grade level equivalent. Both Anne and Gilbert are behind, Anne because her foster families had her watch children over regularly attending school, and Gilbert because his dad was sick for 3 years and they moved to get him better treatment. Gilbert has an edge on Anne with education and natural intellect that wasn't as badly neglected as Anne's, so she has to study harder to make up for her gaps when she decides to take him down. Completely on one side initially, so Anne's grinding her axe trying to beat him while Gilbert is presumably not rage studying like Anne. Whenever Gilbert beats her in a subject, she spent all night studying, and then she would come back the next day to dominate him in class. And he'd congratulate her and it'd drive Anne crazy. Then 2 years later, when they're both taking college prep classes and Anne declares she'll never forgive him, Gilbert throws himself into the academic feud. They both want top student, they both want to place number 1 at the Queen's entrance exam. Their anger at each other results in them using academics as an outlet, and it makes them better students. Anne likes to learn, but subjects like geometry were tricky for her, and Anne already struggled to participate and learn to do things that she didn't consider romantic in nature. Without a need to take Gilbert down, she probably wouldn't have been so dedicated to master and therefore achieve such academic prowess and win scholarships and place first on the entrance exam. The show removes the feud after less than a year, so what's Anne's motivation to be a well-rounded student? There's nothing wrong with having a character propel themselves into academic excess because they think it's the best way to spite their self-appointed arch-nemesis. For some reason, they didn't want to keep Anne's feud for its 5+ years and chose to power through their hatred phase of enemies to lovers and give it more of a will they, won't they, wishy-washy vibe at the end of the season over a slow burn that the book series had. which really robs Anne of her character growth that she gets from it, and also robs over her flaws from being the spotlight. And let's use that for a segue into another sub-rant. Anne's flaws. The problem with Anne's flaws is that she's not really allowed to have them. They have to be watered down or justified actions, so they're really not that bad. When Anne throws a fit and screams at Mrs. Lynde for insulting her, we see she has a temper and reacts emotionally, as 11-year-olds do. But it's not really a bad thing because she was being torn down by an adult. But it was wrong for Mrs. Lynde to do so, and even Marilla and Matthew think it was a good thing for Mrs. Lynde to get taken down a notch. Sure, Anne shouldn't have been screaming and went over the top, but it's an understandable rage. Then, in the book, she screamed at Gilbert and broke a slate over his head for calling her carrots and messing with her braid. Anne, at this point, is overreacting, and we see how bad her temper and insecurity is. Gilbert apologizes and leaves her an apple after lunch, and Anne refuses to talk to him and throws it away. Even Diana advocates for Gilbert, but Anne refuses to budge. When Anne is forced to sit next to Gilbert as punishment for being late when no one else is, Anne feels humiliated and responds by quitting school and doesn't go back until Mrs. Barry bans Anne and Diana from seeing each other after Diana accidentally gets drunk. When Anne is forced to sit next to Gilbert as punishment for being late when no one else is, Anne feels humiliated and responds by quitting school and doesn't go back until Mrs. Barry bans Diana and Anne from being friends, and attending school again is the only way for Anne to see Diana. In the show, they justify nearly all of her actions. The slate scene isn't just about her hair, she's trying to be accepted by her classmates who are ostracizing her. She's not overreacting by quitting school, she has no friends, no one likes her, she doesn't fit in, Gilbert is tormenting her. Her begging not to go to school has the same tone when she's begging Marilla to not return her to the asylum. Anne is sobbing and terrified and heartbroken, and Marilla's all like, such is life, you have to go back to school because you burned a pie and that annoys me. You've already seen what it looks like multiple times when Anne is truly distraught, and you know she's not accepted by a town because you saw her get bullied so badly. She ran away, but you're going to force her to go back anyways? Really, Marilla? Marilla's an intelligent person and was afraid Anne wouldn't fit in, yet refuses to be sensitive to Anne's feelings when she doesn't fit in like she feared. This scene just doesn't make sense. She's callous when attempting to console Gilbert after the loss of his father, making it all about her hardships instead. But one conversation with an adult later, and she's ready to apologize. She's a brat about having Jerry accompany her to sell the horse. Honestly, she's pretty rude to Jerry for most of the series, but I like her less than the scene. When I read the books and Anne refuses to apologize to Mrs. Lynde or accept Gilbert's apology, the book makes sure you understand that she's hurt and lashing out because people were attacking her insecurities. Even if he's out of line, you can still understand her actions. But when Marilla tells Anne Jerry has to go with, Anne's first remark is that it's a quintessential hero's journey and she feels like she's being cheated out of a romantic adventure from her imagination. Girl, Matthew almost died. You're in debt. You're about to lose your home. Maybe don't focus on yourself? Anne's dramatic and emotional, but she's not this self-centered. Push out Anne's overreactive temper tantrums and grudges to make her the victim, and then add in new flaws that make it come across as self-centered instead. But it all gets resolved quickly, so there's really no point to it aside from drama. I liked the fact that she overreacted and had emotional extremes. It made sense with her upbringing, and it was also something that she had to learn to control as she got older, and that not every single situation demands an overtly positive or overtly negative reaction. House fire. Ruby Gillis's house never catches fire in the book. Since everyone but Diana and Gilbert bully and ostracize Anne, the writers had to come up with a way for people to be forced to realize she's actually pretty cool and not a freak of nature. So, how do they accomplish this? Having Anne's actions single-handedly slow the fire down and therefore being the main reason the house is saved. Then Ruby has to stay with Anne and they become friends! Yay! Ruby probably never would have liked Anne without her first having to save her house and then spending quality one-on-one time with her without the influence of her clique suppressing her decision-making. The show took a character with the ability to charm nearly everybody she meets and instead made her a social outcast and then had to build a ladder to climb itself out of the hole they dug, and this is a problem that reoccurs through the show. And the housewife. Episode 4 also has a big focus on the minister's decision that if Anne doesn't want to go to school, that's fine because it's more important to be a housewife. So Anne's facing either continue education or just be trained to be a good housewife, even though Anne doesn't think anyone will want to marry her. Look, Anne doesn't quit learning. She just temporarily quits school. She even tells Marilla that she'll study at home. She just doesn't want to go back to school because she was humiliated and disrespected. Whereas Netflix Anne quits and doesn't even think about self-teaching and liked to learn. She had a passion for reading even before she started regularly attending school. She knows how to suffocate the fire because the orphanage fire manual is the only thing there was for her to read. But her reading and academic passion goes out the window when she quits school. Instead, she stands on the chicken coop and sings to herself. And it kind of looks like she's losing it a little. Anne ultimately decides to go back to school, so kudos to her for choosing education, the thing she was already interested in, over being a housewife, something she believes is unlikely to happen because she thinks no one would like her appearance and no boy would enjoy her personality. The show really expected that to be a debate, huh? You'd think that maybe this debate was pulled from the book written in the early 1900s, but no. Anne attends school, and Marilla expects her to go back even when she quits. Matthew and Marilla are excited when Anne gets selected for college prep classes, and they support her academic achievements and feel a sense of pride when she wins awards for her high grades. But I guess they need a reason for Anne to decide to go back to school. It's not like she had a reason to go back in the first place in the books. It's also a real problem because if we're thinking about it, really a better story arc would be Anne believing she could be a housewife, not in the sense that she should give up her dreams of having a career, but she doesn't like herself. She was never taught to love herself, and no one's ever loved her, so there was really no serious debate in her not going back to school and being a housewife, because how could she ever believe that someone would want to marry her? She could never choose that career because she doesn't think she's lovable or likable, or that anyone could care about her outside of her friendship with Diana and the Cuthberts. So it was really a pointless debate. A better character arc would be her realizing that she is lovable and people could want to be married to her. And Carrie scene. Anne gets her period in the show, but in the book it is never mentioned. It was written in the early 1900s, and it was definitely too scandalous. I don't actually have anything against this edition. It's not in the book, but it's a realistic thing that would have happened to Anne, and it doesn't change the plot or story arc. And the hysterical reaction to learn how to bleed every month for decades? Spot on. I knew what a period was, and I still handled my first one with the same grace and calmness as Anne does. Also, if you've never apologized to your mom for being an absolute nightmare to deal with during puberty, here's your reminder. And if you think you aren't, you are. Anne and Diana's forbidden friendship. This event is actually pretty accurate with some minor changes. Anne is still boycotting school in the book when she has tea, as opposed to Marilla letting her have tea to perk her up while she feels bad during the first period. Only Diana gets drunk in the book because she downs 3 glasses while Anne gets food and is immediately sick from it. They get banned from seeing each other and have their farewell in the woods, not the schoolhouse, but I could live with these minor changes. Except I don't understand why they chose to sub in the non-existent to be a housewife or not a housewife instead of this to motivate Anne to go back to school. That was the whole reason why she agreed to attend this place she felt like she'd been humiliated in, because even just getting to see Diana was the only comfort she could get, and she loved her so much she would go back for her. It showed how much she cared about her. Instead, these things are already being resolved, and it doesn't, the substitution just is weird and unnecessary. The dresses. Puff sleeves are the fashion of the time, and when Anne first arrives, she begs Marilla for them, to no avail. Matthew doesn't decide to get Anne a puff sleeves dress because of Anne's lamenting and begging for them, but rather when she has her playmates come over, and he notices how different her dresses are from her playmates and decides to remedy it. Matthew is painfully shy around most women, so he can't manage to ask the female shopkeep for a dress, and instead gets Mrs. Lynde to sew a few fashionable dresses for Anne. Matthew doesn't give Anne the dresses on a random day. It's her Christmas present. And while Marilla isn't happy about it, she starts making Anne fashionable dresses because there's no way she's having Mrs. Lynde be gone to instead of her for clothing her own child. The difference doesn't monumentally make a difference in the show. However, this is just a segue into a big change they chose to add in along with Matthew getting the dresses, and that is Matthew's what if romance. Matthew's what if romance. I don't like the Jeannie subplot mainly because it makes Matthew's entire life have a tragic undertone to it. Matthew wasn't very comfortable talking to women and kept to himself in general. His father built Green Gables away from town purposely to avoid people, and Matthew inherited this disposition. He didn't have a blooming childhood romance tragically cut short due to the untimely death of his brother. He didn't have an older brother, in fact. And I don't like the addition because Marilla already had a romance that went poorly. They didn't need to have both siblings suffer a lost romance. What could have been romances can be interesting and compelling storylines as you watch couples decades later, now older and wiser, still struggle with whatever caused them to separate, overcome and reinforce that you're truly never too old for a second chance at romance. But when you take a character who initially didn't have a romance because it wasn't in their personality and then add one in, it feels less heartwarming tale of love and second chances and more like the show didn't think it was believable or compelling enough that Matthew was happy with his choices and preferred living on the farm with his sister over marrying someone from town. And Matthew did discover a type of love he'd previously missed out on, parenthood. Matthew sticks to having familiar relationships and his job as a farmer, and he's happy. There's nothing tragic missing from his life, and when he dies, the whole town turns out because even though he was essentially a recluse, he was still a kind person whose absence was mourned. Why does his life choice have to be turned into a tragic or secretly missing something when Anne is supposed to be the missing puzzle piece, not Jeannie? This romance subplot feels like it was written by Anne and her penchant for tragical romances. Speaking of other tragedies, problem with Michael and Marilla's romance. Marilla did used to court Gilbert's father. Then he did something that angered her and she stopped talking to him. By the time she had swallowed pride, he had moved on. Marilla reveals this to Anne at the end when she finally befriends Gilbert, and it serves as a lens for what could have been with Anne and Gilbert, and also ends up being foreshadowing as it takes Anne a stupid amount of time for her to admit her feelings to Gilbert despite everyone else around her knowing it. That's not enough for the show, apparently, as they turn into John wanting to travel and Marilla not being able to part with her family obligations and being left behind to wonder, what if? The addition of Michael was a nauseating change for me. Okay, well, most of the show's book to Netflix changes were nauseating for me, but the tragic undertone and loss of independence this edition stole from Matthew and Marilla's self-determination really irks me. Instead of a brother and sister choosing to live out their life on their family farm in the home their father built with his bare hands, it becomes a sort of prison. Sure, they both loved the farm, but how different things would have been if only Michael had lived. Michael's death is directly responsible for Marilla's failed romance. It's not Marilla's pride that's her shortcoming, but her obligation to her family and inability to put herself first. Watching the graveyard scene where Marilla is reminiscing about how John asked her to travel and she wishes she had taken the chance, but held back because she wasn't brave enough, was frustrating because it creates this potential hidden resentment with both Matthew and Marilla that if only Michael had stayed alive and if only they'd been brave enough, they wouldn't be stuck working their family farm as opposed to them living and working on their family farm because they actually enjoyed that life. Also, Marilla, maybe don't wonder what could have been out loud with John's newly orphaned son and imply you could have been his mom. That's for internal use only. I just wish the show didn't feel like taking adults who were content with their life and adding in this regret about what could have been. Yes, Marilla's pride ruined her relationship with John in the book, but there aren't multiple scenes where she implies regret and is chafing under her conviction to family obligation that's still weighing on her decades later. And they have Matthew love farming to the point that despite having spells with his heart, he refuses to slow down. But it gets undercut when you have scenes where Matthew talks about Michael and how different things would have been. I don't know why the show thinks it can pull off the sibling duo who adopt a child and live on an idyllic farm together, and also have both adults being weighed down by sudden regret of their dedication to obligations several decades later. It doesn't work for me. So maybe I'm reading this wrong, but I think this show really wanted to make sure Anne was interpreted as a strong female character and have a positive spotlight on female education and being your own woman and not being confined by the patriarchy. But it seems really heavy-handed. In multiple episodes, there's this idea of being your own woman that Anne has to contend with and ultimately accept. At first, it's capitulating to societal expectations and being a housewife versus pushing back and getting an education. Then it's having a career versus having a husband and how to balance a romantic outlook on life and aspirations along with wanting to be independent and career driven. These aren't bad subjects to tackle, but it feels like Anne's doing a speed run of her various role confusions she has to and will have to contend with all at the age of 11. Anne romanticizes different life events like having a tragical romance or being a bride, but doesn't really believe she'll actually be married because she's been told she's ugly and obnoxious and terrible and too much trouble by her previous families, and she's taken it to heart. But Book Anne has never had this debate over whether to go back to school because she never gives up her education when she boycotts school. She has no problem being behind in class. It is embarrassing to her, but she still loves learning and reading. Her real problem is with her mistreatment by her teacher and being forced to sit with the boys next to Gilbert Blythe, of all of them. Anne is passionate and tends to react in her extremes. Gilbert called her names, so she passionately hates him. Likewise, she passionately loves Diana so much she's upset at the idea of a husband taking her away. When she comes home, Anne promises to still go through her lessons, and she does. She is firm on self-studying until she's banned from being friends with Diana. It's weird to watch this conflict over education and bettering herself versus accepting the role of a housewife when this wasn't a conflict for Anne at the age of 11. The issue here was Anne needed to learn how to temper her reactions and not blow it to the point of her own detriment when something upset her. The plotline of whether to be her own person or train herself to be a proper person for her husband doesn't land the way I think the writers intended. Anne doesn't like herself. She doesn't like her hair. She doesn't like her name. She doesn't like her backstory. She doesn't think people can like her. She never outright states it, but it's so obvious from her behavior. She asked Diana if she could manage to like her a little because she's never had a friend, has been brought to believe she's a burden, unlikable, unwanted. She's always excited to meet someone who she considers a kindred spirit, and that's understandable. But there is something special about being around people you just click with, but I don't think kindred spirits are as rare as Anne believes them to be. Rather, her expectations are brought so low by her abusive upbringing, she thinks finding someone who she likes and understands her to be an anomaly. Anne knows in her head it's impossible for someone to want to marry her. She even admits to Marilla that she doesn't think she's likely to get a husband. So when Anne finally goes to Marilla and declares she's going back to school, it's not an important decision Anne makes to be her own person or lay down a foundation of independence and self-sufficiency, but an inevitable one because Anne doesn't think anyone would want to marry her. It's not surprising when the child abuse survivor shies away from a potential romantic future. When you're raised to believe you're nothing but trouble, how could you fathom someone liking you enough to be friends, let alone marry you? It's good that Anne is valuing her education. I'm not arguing with that. But this wasn't the right thing to pair it against. If you want to deviate from the book, they could have run with the conversation Anne has with Jerry, where she tries to imagine careers she could have without school, and Jerry hitting back with how lucky she is to be able to get an education. Have Anne's imagination and disconnection with reality be interfering with the practicality that education would open more doors for her to fulfill dreams. And it would still be an unnecessary deviation from the plot, but at least it wouldn't be pretending Anne was serious about something that she couldn't emotionally or mentally fathom at that point in her life. Or, stick to the actual plot of the book. They're adapting. Silly suggestion, but, just want to throw that out there. And the subject of marriage comes up a lot, and trying to decide between marriage or having a career. She's always dreamed about being a bride, but she doesn't know about being a wife, and admittedly gets really good advice from Josephine that she can either get married or have a career and buy herself a white dress. But Anne's 11 at this point in the show, and the scene feels like it's a decisive moment in her life path. Every time they talk about marriage so much, and all I could think was, she's 11! Why is this weighing on her so much? She's still got about 10 years before her peers start getting hitched. In the book series, Diana gets married when she's 21. Anne doesn't receive marriage proposals until she's about 18. As best as I could tell, no one gets married at 16. The Netflix show does have Mr. Phillips propose to Prissy Andrews via spelling bee, and she is 16, but in the book, Mr. Phillips leaves after teaching for about a year. The conflict of getting married and who to marry is something Anne faces in the sequels, along with having to contend with her imaginations of the perfect husband getting in the way of her actual feelings for her male suitors. I think the show was trying to show a young audience through Anne to not be worried about marriage, and real value is education and how you want to live your life, and to put a modern view on women and education in a show set in the late 1800s. Everyone's aware the typical life of a Canadian woman at that time would be getting minimal education, marrying young, and being a housewife, while the husband supported the family. And I appreciate the concern I think the show had in not wanting to romanticize that to a young audience, but in an effort to go against the grain and include modern ideals for women, they ignore the feminism already in Anne's character arc. Anne is an orphan in the late 1800s who gets an education, not only passes the entrance exam for college, she scores #1 on the list. She gets a teaching degree in 1 year instead of 2 and wins a scholarship that will pay her way through Redmond College to get her a bachelor's degree. Are her academic achievements in the book not a feminist enough story arc? Like I said, Anne goes through a lot of challenges growing up and adversity, and it's hard to get behind the changes the show puts in when they're harder than what the character would have been going through, or they substitute in different changes the character are going through for seemingly no reason. The entirety of episode 7. Oh, this episode. The grand season finale that has to be interesting enough for Netflix to order a second season. I cannot decide whether this episode or episode 2 was worse. They both caused me excruciating amounts of pain to watch and featured essentially nothing from its source material, and it is so freaking dramatic. It's awful. So let's break down everything wrong with this season finale. First off, cross failing. I'm a broken record at this point, but this isn't how it happened in the book. The Cuthberts do experience financial trouble at the very end when Anne graduated from Queen's College. Matthew, who's been suffering with heart problems for over 5 years, dies from cardiac arrest upon reading the newspaper that their bank had failed. They didn't have a really sweet conversation before he dies about how proud he is of her, and Marilla and Anne struggle with their grief and ultimately reaffirm their relationship and bond with each other in the final chapters. Marilla finds out that she's going blind and can only stop if she wears glasses and doesn't read and sew, her favorite activities. Faced with being alone in a house, she puts Green Gables up for sale, but Gilbert resigns from his job as a teacher at their old school and gives it to Anne so she can afford to stay at Green Gables with Marilla and not sell their family farm. Instead, the show chooses to have financial troubles happen within Anne's first year of living with Cuthberts, and to have Matthew barely survive a coronary thrombosis, which is a blood clot in the blood vessels of the heart. And the doctor's right. He is lucky to be alive. The body does not do well with blood clots. Speaking of blood clots, let's have a quick PSA about strokes. Every year, more than 795,000 people in the U.S. have a stroke, and it kills about 140,000 Americans per year. That's 1 out of 20 deaths. It is the leading cause in serious long-term disability, reducing mobility in over half of stroke survivors aged 65 and over. Depending on the area of your brain that's affected, different disabilities occur. If your stroke is in your left brain, then your right side will be impacted with potential paralysis, speech language problems, or memory loss, and vice versa. Recovery can be a really arduous process. That's why you should always be fast for stroke. Sudden loss of balance, loss of vision in one or both eyes, facial droop, ask the person to smile, raise eyebrows, repeat a certain phrase, arm or leg hanging down, ask them to raise both arms, see if one isn't coming up, and time. Time of the symptom onset and last known well times. Patients who are at the ER within 3 hours of their first symptoms have less disability 3 months after those with delayed care. Remember, time is brain. For more information about strokes, visit www.stroke.org and www.cdc.gov. Links in the description below. Now, back to your scheduled rant. They're taking a loan out from the bank to buy high-yielding crops to recoup their losses from this year, but with him put on intense bed rest for several months, the bank recalls their loan until the end of the month. This episode runs as a traditional poor underdogs trying to not lose their home. Merle and Anne do whatever they can to raise money before the debt is due, from selling family possessions to putting out advertising for boarders and cleaning houses. And, of course, they turn down multiple financial offers to assist them because they don't take charity. Can I just say how much I hate this character trait? This isn't show specific, this is just a pet peeve. A protagonist is in debt, and their financially more well-off friends offer to contribute or collect donations, but the protagonist, who is in dire straits and has lost hope has apparently managed to keep their pride. Like, you're about to lose your house, Marilla. Take the money. Oh, I'm sure you're homeless on the street with your bedridden brother and Anne. Your pride will be keeping you warm then. I will give this show props for Anne being taught by Josephine Barry that love isn't charity, and she in turn convinces Marilla to take money from Mrs. Barry. That is a very good change, and I'm glad to see it, because that plotline is just so annoying. Don't get the entire loan paid back, so the show ends with the family's possession of Green Gables still technically at risk at the end of the... They don't get the entire loan paid back, so the show ends season 1 with the family's possession of Green Gables technically still at risk of foreclosure. Marilla plans to approach the bank and renegotiate repayment schedule after Christmas, and the tone of the show wants you guys to assume that they'll be successful, and I'm sure it will be, but it's still up in the air until you get an answer from the bank, and considering they set Anne up to not have faith in her security at Green Gables, you wouldn't think she'd be so calm about not having a definite answer of whether or not they would keep their house. This child experiences repeat instability with her home and emotional support, but she's still very hopeful about Marilla's plan, and it doesn't feel believable that Anne would think that they're going to be okay. Also, the doctor said strict bed rest and taking it easy for months, and walking around outside in the winter is not strict bed rest. And it's been maybe 2-3 weeks at most because the bank withdraws the loan and then gives them till the end of the month, and Marilla says she'll talk with the bank after Christmas, so at most it's December 24th. And at most 24 days have passed since Matthew's coronary thrombosis, but realistically, less than that. Yes, walking does not seem very strenuous, but his heart is incredibly weak, and I'm pretty sure his bedroom is on the second floor. Do the writers not have any idea how strenuous it would be for him to climb up those stairs? Probably not. I know this seems like a really minor nitpick, but you can't set a rule that your characters can be incapacitated and extremely incapacitated for months, and then have them walking around a few weeks later and they're looking okay. Like, the entire reason the loan got called back was because Matthew wouldn't be able to do any farm work, but he's able to be up and about, walking around in the snow. Where was the plot-driven problem then? Book-wise, it ends with the Cuthbert's possession of Green Gables secured, with Anne choosing to give up her scholarship and teaching while taking courses at home. She was going to teach at school farther away, but Gilbert gives up his job to let Anne stay with Marilla. It parallels Marilla's decision to take Anne in purely just to provide her a good home, despite not feeling suited for the task. Likewise, Anne gives up her scholarship and just the life change of taking care of Marilla. It's tragic, but Marilla's eye problems and Matthew's deaths are foreshadowed throughout the novel. Marilla's headaches are mentioned multiple times, along with Matthew's heart conditions. It's a payout that Montgomery sets up, and Anne's decision to segue into her next chapter of adult life, with new challenges she'll face as she takes up more mantles of adult responsibilities. Whereas the film moves up his heart episode and hasn't survived it for a dramatic season finale, and the final scene when the borders are... the final scene where the Borders are there and it's the muggers is meant to pique curiosity, since we know that they're unscrupulous since they'll mug children for cash. But I can't fathom how long they can stick around as a plot device, because they'll be found out ridiculously soon. The second Jerry sees the two, he'll be like, "Zuta laws, these are the men who mug me. They have your money." And the show tries to pull a not recognizing them. I will tell you right now, that's BS. I rewatched the scene. Jerry walks past him, the bearded man grabs and throws him to the ground. The hot one literally stands over the child, makes eye contact, and watches Jerry watch him punch him in the face and body repeatedly as the bearded youth stands by. You could maybe say he wouldn't recognize the guy with the beard, but the hot one, that's going to take a nanosecond for Jerry to spot him. But I can feel in my bones that they will manage to draw it out somehow, some way, through some convenient plot holes. And Dan also conveniently runs into Gilbert, who's putting school on pause to travel the world and leave his family farm to be run over by weeds, I guess. I don't think Gil mentioned if he was renting out the fields. And they put aside their grudge that has gone on for far too long. It lasted like 3 months. Maybe 4. Oh, how long that terrible feud truly was. They keep Gilbert the same personality-wise, but kill his dad and use that to make him a traveler like his dad was. Honestly, the book doesn't go into the Blythe family, so I don't know who Gilbert had at home, but he did want to be a doctor, so he didn't take up farming. But he definitely didn't interrupt his education first to see the world after coming back from having his education interrupted. He's made to sound so insightful with his gap year to find himself, but it's such an idiotic decision. I had to take time off school while my dad was sick and had to keep playing catch up during the semester as I was taking care of him dying, so I missed a ton of school. Perfect time to take a gap year. I believe a middle school, high school age student could be so short-sighted enough to think that this is a good idea, and he did just lose his dad. But man, did his housekeeper just not say anything? After watching the show, I just want to track down the writers, drive to wherever they are, take their faces gently in my hands and whisper, "You're not Riverdale. You don't have to be dramatic. It's okay. People still like shows that aren't dramatic." I don't know what is going on with this trend about having dramatic retellings of a show or a concept with Riverdale, with Anne with an E, arguably Sabrina, but there was a comic that is based off of, so I don't know if that necessarily counts as a dramatic retelling. Really, half the CW shows have some type of dramatic aspect on them, and while it's not the worst concept ever, it is starting to feel overdone and just dramatic for dramatic's sake. And the show confuses me so much because the casting, the acting, the sets, the clothing, everything about that, the detail put into it tells me that people did research, and it seems like there was a lot of care and passion put into this to make a faithful adaptation. But when it comes to the plot, it just seems like they ripped all those pages out and burned them as kindling for the fire in the background sets. Everything I love about the book Anne with an E seems to be taken out to substitute for struggle and pain, whereas reading the book, it is, again, a lighthearted stories of misadventures. And it's not that there isn't room to delve into the psychological effects of Anne growing up as an abused child. And it's not unrealistic for her symptoms and coping mechanisms to be fixed or get better without traditional therapy, because she does get the things that are recommended for PTSD people when she moves into the Gilbert, such as having stability. She's well fed, she flourishes socially, she gets a routine. Arguably, having Marilla is great for her because she has a strict but loving disciplinarian in her life who is going to bring her back down to earth, and she gets plenty of exercise. And there's research that shows that getting exercise really helps with childhood PTSD, and so she would be getting better just through that shifted environment. And yes, therapy, always getting therapy is great, especially with the trauma that she went through. I was so frustrated, and all my poor friends have listened to my rants about everything that's wrong with this, and admittedly I am a bit of a purist when it comes to book to show adaptations. I want every single detail included because I like the book, or I want to see the book but visual, and you can't do every single thing that is in a book as there is in a show. But things like sending Anne back home and making her just suffer all the time, it feels like they don't care about Anne. It feels like she's a character for a dramatic high-stakes show, but for preteens. Whereas when you lead Anne to Green Gables, and the author based Anne, part of Anne at least, off of her personality and upbringing, so you just feel like this genuine love and care for Anne that I don't get in the show, because she's just tormented so often. Like, the children literally dance around her and sing about how she's a garbage person. So I haven't watched any of the other seasons because from a quick glance at the synopsises and the promos that Netflix forces you to watch, it only seems to have gotten worse. I know there's plenty of people out there who love the show on its own, though on its own the show doesn't seem as good to me, based on the merits of, like, Marilla throwing her out and that whole debate of, like, should I go to school? Should I not get to go to school? Should I have a career? Should I not get married? And it's like, you don't like yourself, though. Let's focus on you liking yourself and learning to think that recognizing yourself for the wonderful person that you are before you have this debate, because it's not a genuine debate until you believe that you're capable of love and affection. And also, given that she's got that childhood, her having a relationship is more successful than not having a relationship, because she's been so abused that it's harder for people who suffered abuse to believe that they're deserving of good relationships. Those topics in the story just kind of ruined it for me, and dramas are kind of a hit or miss for me just in general. I can go through some shows and be like, it's so dramatic and stuff and I love it, and other times it's like, this is too much. This character's gotten shot 5 times this season. So in conclusion, is there anything I like about Anne with an E? The set designs, the characters, the acting, the visuals, everything about that is so pretty and on point, but the plot just crumbles, and I hope in 10 years from now, when another adaptation is being made, that it'll be so much more accurate, because I love that book, and I think it is a great story to have in a visual media. And if anyone out there is doing an adaptation of a book, please, 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 accuracy is so amazing. You're adapting it for a reason. Stick to the plot. Conclusion, taking something lighthearted and saying, what if this, but dark, is not necessarily the best change to make. And I can only imagine what horrible deviation circus the other seasons were. Have a nice day.